The cold bit through the leather of his flight jacket, a familiar, almost comforting sensation. Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann, at 21 years old, already bore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves on his throat, a testament to 148 confirmed kills painted in neat white stripes along the fuselage of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G-6. He sat in the cockpit at dispersal on the airfield at Mamaia, Romania, the morning sun of May 30, 1944, glinting off the Black Sea to the east. The air smelled of damp earth, oil, and the faint, ever-present tang of gasoline. He watched a ground crewman, breath fogging in the chill, wipe the morning dew from the glass of his Revi 16 billion gunsight. Through his headset, crackling with static, came the voice of his wingman, Unteroffizier Walter Krupinski. "Another milk run, Erich." Krupinski's tone was light bored. "The Amis are sending their bombers to Ploiesti again. More of those fat, slow liberators, like shooting ducks in a barrel." Hartmann allowed himself a small smile, adjusting the worn leather strap of his helmet. "Perhaps they think the oil is worth the price, Walter. We shall make the bill very expensive for them today." His confidence was not arrogance, it was arithmetic. In the skies over the Eastern Front he had perfected his tactic. Sehen entscheiden angreifen abhauen sie, decide, attack, break off. He stalked his prey, close to point-blank range, often under 50 meters, fired a devastating burst from his single 30 Mk108 cannon and two 13 machine guns, and vanished before the enemy knew what hit him. Against Soviet pilots in their sturdy but less agile Lavochkins and Yaks, it was brutally effective. The American bomber crews he had encountered so far in the defense of the Romanian oil fields were brave, their formations tight, but their escort fighters, the P-38 Lightnings and the occasional early-model P-51 Mustangs, seemed cautious, predictable. They lacked the instinct, the predatory aggression honed over hundreds of combat sorties. To Hartmann and the other aces of Jagdschwader 52, the Americans were competent, well-equipped amateurs playing a professional's game. The Bf 109, particularly his Gustav model, was an extension of his own body, light, responsive, a master of the vertical. Its Daimler-Benz DB 605 engine sang a specific, powerful song as he climbed. He knew its every limit, and within those limits he was invincible. What he did not know, what no intelligence briefing from the Luftwaffe's Fremd Luftwaffen West, Foreign Air Forces West, office had accurately conveyed, was that the game itself was about to change. The Americans were not sending the same players. They had brought a new weapon to the field, one that defied every piece of data in the dog-eared recognition manuals carried by German pilots. And on this clear morning over the Balkans, Erich Hartmann, the soon-to-be highest-scoring ace in history, was about to have his entire understanding of aerial combat violently rewritten. The reports of a new, formidable American escort fighter had been circulating for months, dismissed by veteran pilots as exaggerations or the excuses of lesser men. Hartmann himself had seen a brief, grainy photograph passed around the mess hall with snickers. It looked like a barrel with wings. They had laughed. Today, the laughter would die in their throats. The confidence that bordered on contempt in the hearts of men like Hartmann was not born in a vacuum. It was the product of years of undeniable, quantifiable success. Since the early days of the war, the Luftwaffe fighter arm had established a fearsome reputation. Pilots like Werner Mölders, Adolf Galland, and the rising star Hartmann himself had piled up staggering victory tallies. The tactics, the technology, and the training had created a culture of elite warriors. By mid-1944, despite the relentless bombing of German cities and the growing strength of the Western Allies, the fighter pilots still believed in their qualitative edge. Intelligence assessments fed this belief. A captured Allied document from late 1943, painstakingly analyzed by the WWII, estimated American fighter production capacity at around 500 units per month. German aircraft designers, masters of incremental, sophisticated improvements, nodded sagely. They could match that with superior machines. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, with its radial engine and heavy armament, was a beast. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, in its latest iterations, was a refined killer. The coming Me-262 jet fighter promised to leapfrog propeller technology entirely. On paper, and in the experience of pilots who had fought Americans over Tunisia, Sicily, and the approaches to Germany, the balance seemed manageable. The cultural lens distorted the view further. A pervasive belief within the German high command, subtly echoed in pilot briefings, was that American society was soft, materialistic, and incapable of producing soldiers with the same Kampfgeist fighting spirit as the German Jäger. American pilots were seen as well-fed, well-trained technicians, but not instinctive hunters. Their machines reflected this: heavy, rugged, designed for durability over finesse. A technical comparison chart issued to JG-52 pilots in early 1944 listed the primary American escort threat as the P-38 Lightning. Its specs were known: twin engines, good speed, heavy firepower. The chart noted its weaknesses: vulnerability to head-on attacks, poor roll rate at high speed, and a tendency for compressibility in steep dives. The new P-51 Mustang was mentioned, but early models with the Allison engine were dismissed as mediocre at high altitude. The P-47 Thunderbolt was listed as a heavy, ground attack aircraft, dangerous to bombers, but a lumbering target for a nimble 109. The data was precise, detailed, and catastrophically obsolete. A few voices had tried to sound the alarm. Oberstleutnant Gustav Rödel, a respected commander, had written a memo after encountering unfamiliar, high-performing American fighters over the Adriatic. He described aircraft that could match the Bf-109's climb, outperform it at extreme altitude, and stay with it in a dive. His report was filed under unconfirmed observations, possibly experimental types. Another pilot, returning from a harrowing mission over Vienna, swore he had been chased by a Mustang that refused to break off, pursuing him almost to the deck with terrifying persistence. He was told he must have mistaken a late-model Spitfire. The psychological need to believe in their own superiority created a powerful filter. Accepting that the Americans had not only caught up but potentially surpassed them in a key area of technology was unthinkable. It was easier to blame the observer than to question the paradigm. This institutional blindness, this failure to connect the dots of scattered, alarming reports, was about to collide with industrial reality. For while German intelligence was analyzing production numbers from 1943, American factories had already entered a realm of output that defied German comprehension. What was coming for Hartmann and his comrades was not merely a new airplane. It was the physical manifestation of an entire nation's industrial and scientific might, focused with laser precision on solving a single problem: how to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The solution was the North American P-51 Mustang, but not the early Allison-engined version. This was the P-51 Billion, and increasingly, the P-51D, powered by the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in Detroit. The story of this transformation is one of brilliant improvisation and staggering scale. The Mustang's airframe, designed in an astonishing 117 days by a team led by Edgar Schmude, a German-born immigrant, was a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency. Its laminar flow wing, a concept barely understood in Europe, reduced drag dramatically. But the true alchemy happened when the Merlin was married to this sleek airframe. The Packard Merlin V-1650-3 was a supercharged, liquid-cooled V12 that produced over 1,500 horsepower. It transformed the Mustang from a good low-altitude fighter into a high-altitude demon. At 30,000 feet, where Bf-109s and FW-190s began to gasp and lose power, the Mustang's supercharger kicked in, delivering sea-level performance. Its top speed of around 440 mph above 25,000 feet was not just a number on a chart. It was 30 to 50 mph faster than the latest German fighters at that critical altitude. But speed was only part of the story. The men who built this weapon were as remarkable as the machine. At the North American Aviation Plant in Inglewood, California, and later in Dallas, Texas, production lines hummed with an intensity unknown in Germany. Workers, many of them women, Rosie the Riveter, was not a propaganda myth, assembled Mustangs with relentless efficiency. The manufacturing philosophy was different. German engineering prized precision and complexity. American engineering prized reliability, serviceability, and volume. A German fighter might have a more elegant engine mount. An American fighter had an engine mount that could be replaced by a crew chief with basic tools in under an hour. This difference in philosophy would prove decisive. While German factories struggled under bombing, dispersed production, and material shortages, American factories operated with near immunity, fed by a continent's worth of resources. The numbers were incomprehensible to a mind conditioned by European industrial scales. In 1941, North American produced 1,200 aircraft total. In 1944, they would produce over 14,000, the vast majority of them Mustangs. In the first quarter of 1944 alone, as Hartmann added another dozen kills to his tally, American factories built 25 P-51s. The entire German fighter production for the same period, across all types, Bf-109s, FW-190s, jets, was less than 3,000. And the Mustang was just one fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that barrel with wings, was rolling out of Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, at a similar rate. The P-38 Lightning was in full production at Lockheed in Burbank. Germany was not fighting squadrons of new aircraft. It was fighting the output of entire industrial cities dedicated solely to building machines of war. Each Mustang that took off from England was not a precious, hand-finished weapon like a Bf-109. It was a unit of production, one of thousands, designed to be flown hard, repaired quickly, and replaced immediately if lost. This was a war of attrition the Luftwaffe, with its cadre of irreplaceable veteran aces, was structurally incapable of winning. But in the spring of 1944, that reality had not yet crashed into the consciousness of the men in the cockpits. They were about to get the first, brutal data point. The signs had been there, scattered like ominous breadcrumbs across the skies of Europe, but the German fighter command had been too busy putting out fires to read the pattern. The first encounters were isolated, confusing, and quickly rationalized away. In late February 1944, during the opening phases of the Big Week bombing campaign, a swarm of FW-190s from JG-11 intercepted a formation of B-17s near Brunswick. The escort was noted as P-51s. The German pilots attacked from above, their standard tactic. To their shock, the Mustangs turned into them, not to evade but to engage. A furious dogfight ensued at over 28,000 feet. The Focke-Wulfs, excellent fighters at medium altitude, found themselves outclimbed and outmaneuvered in the thin air. 2 were shot down. The surviving pilots reported, breathlessly, that the new Mustangs were sehr leistungsfähig im Herrenbereich, very high-performing at altitude. The intelligence officers noted the report, but attributed the losses to numerical inferiority and unfavorable tactical position. A more chilling report came from the Mediterranean. In April, a reconnaissance Bf-109 over northern Italy was jumped by a lone fighter it could not identify. The German pilot, an experienced Oberfeldwebel, dove for the deck, using the Messerschmitt's excellent negative G capability in a maneuver that usually shook Allied pursuers. This time, the enemy fighter stayed with him through the entire dive, closing the gap. Only a desperate low-level dash into a valley saved him. He described the aircraft as having a distinctive, streamlined fuselage, a bubble canopy, and a four-bladed propeller. His debriefing officer suggested it must have been a specially modified Spitfire Mk. XIV. The pilot insisted it was not. His report was stamped Einzelfall, isolated case. Perhaps the most prophetic warning came not from a pilot, but from an engineer. A German technical intelligence team had recovered parts of a crashed P-51 billion in Italy. The examination of its laminar flow wing and its Packard Merlin engine sent a shock through the small circle of designers who saw the reports. One of them, a stressed and overworked engineer at Messerschmitt's Augsburg Design Bureau, wrote a private memo to his section head. He detailed the Mustang's aerodynamic advantages and, crucially, analyzed its range. By calculating fuel tank sizes and the Merlin's specific fuel consumption, he made a terrifying deduction. This fighter could fly from England to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes, and return. If true, it meant the Reich's heartland was no longer a sanctuary for its defenders. The memo was marked speculative and buried under more pressing concerns about jet engine compressor blades and production quotas for the 109,000 model. The engineer's calculations, however, were precise. The sanctuary was already gone. These disparate warnings, the tactical reports from shaken pilots, the technical analysis from alarmed engineers, never coalesced into a revised threat assessment for the frontline units. The machinery of the Third Reich, bogged down in bureaucracy and poisoned by a culture that punished bearers of bad news, failed to synthesize the information. The pilots of JG-52, transferred from the Eastern Front to defend the Ploiesti oil complex, received the standard briefings. Beware of P-38s, expect some P-51s. Watch for flak and the aggressive but predictable American bomber gunners. The idea that they would be engaged by swarms of a fighter that could outperform them at their own game, piloted by men who were now gaining experience and confidence with every mission, was not part of the plan. The gap between what the German high command believed and what was screaming towards them at 400 miles per hour was a chasm about to be crossed in fire and aluminum. And on the morning of May 30, 1944, that chasm's far edge was represented by the 31st Fighter Group, USAAF, flying from San Severo, Italy. Their target, escort B-17s and B-24s to Ploiesti. Their orders, clear the skies. The first thing Hartmann noticed was the contrails, high, delicate white scratches against the deep blue far to the west. Not the thick, clustered lines of a bomber stream, but the finer, more scattered threads of fighters. A lot of fighters. He counted mentally as his swarm of 4 Bf-109s climbed westward, the DB-605 engines howling at maximum continuous power. 8, 12, 16, the numbers kept growing. This was not the usual light escort screen. Through his headphones, the voice of his Gruppenkommandeur, Major Adolf Borchers, crackled. Achtung, Indianer. The code word for enemy fighters. Many contacts, high 10 o'clock, possibly 2 Gruppen. Hartmann felt a first, faint tremor of unease. The sheer number was unusual. He scanned the sky, his eyes, trained by 3 years of combat, picking out the specks. They were still dots, but their formation was loose, confident. They weren't hugging the bombers. They were ranging ahead, sweeping the sky. "Walter, keep sharp," he radioed to Krupinski. "This looks like more than a taxi ride." Then the dots began to descend. Not in a frantic dive, but in a controlled, shallow descent that ate up the altitude advantage the Germans had worked so hard to gain. The range closed with alarming speed. Hartmann squinted, trying to identify the silhouettes. They weren't the twin-tailed outlines of P-38s. They were single-engine, but the profile was wrong for a Thunderbolt sleeker, more tapered. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. Mustangs, but not like any Mustangs he'd seen before. These had a smooth, rounded fuselage behind the cockpit, not the razorback spine of the earlier models. "Mustangs," he reported calmly. "New type, bubble canopy." Borcher's voice came back steady. "Numbers mean nothing, remember they break off. They don't have the fuel to stay, hit hard and break away. Veal Gluck." The two formations merged with a silent, terrifying swiftness. The physics of the encounter were wrong from the first second. Hartman, leading his swarm, picked a target and initiated a climbing turn to position himself for a deflection shot. The Bf-109G-6, laden with underwing cannon pods for bomber killing, was not at its most agile, but it should have been more than a match for a long-range escort fighter. He pulled into the turn, feeling the GS press him into his seat. He glanced over his shoulder. The Mustang he had targeted had not continued on its path. It had turned with him. Not just followed, it had matched his turn, maintaining its angular position. The rate of turn was similar, but the Mustang seemed to be doing it effortlessly, without the visible strain and speed bleed he felt in his heavier Gustav. A burst of tracers streaked past his canopy, not from his target but from another Mustang he hadn't seen. He snapped into a violent brake, rolling left and pulling hard. The 109 shuddered. The Mustang followed, sticking to him like a shadow. This was impossible. American fighters didn't dogfight like this. They made slashing attacks and ran. This one was engaging. Hartman pushed the stick forward, nosing into a dive. The altimeter began to unwind. 24,000 feet, 23,000, 22,000. The airspeed needle quivered past 650 km/h. He glanced in his mirror. The Mustang was still there, a dark shape growing larger. It wasn't falling behind. If anything, it was gaining in the dive. A memory flashed, the dismissed report about compressibility. The P-38 was known for it. This thing was diving like a stone. He heard Krupinski's voice, sharp with alarm. "Erich, I can't shake him, he's on me. He's fast. Break right and dive, Walter. I'm coming." Hartman hauled back on the stick, his vision graying at the edges from the G-force, trying to reverse his direction. The 109 protested, the airframe groaning. As he came level, he saw it. A Mustang, its nose painted a bright yellow, was locked onto Krupinski's 109. Four long, bright flames licked from its wings. Not the 6 or 8 guns of a Thunderbolt, but 4 heavy machine guns. The tracers walked through the sky, converging with horrifying accuracy. Hartman saw pieces fly off Krupinski's tail. "Walter, Ostagen, jump!" There was no response. The Mustang fired another, shorter burst. Krupinski's 109 seemed to stagger in midair, then a plume of dark smoke erupted from its engine. It rolled onto its back and began to spin down, a comet of fire and debris. No parachute emerged. Rage and shock flooded Hartman's system. Walter was gone. In a matter of seconds, to a fighter that wasn't supposed to be able to do this. The radio was now a cacophony of confused, desperate voices. "Sie sind überall. They are everywhere. He's turning inside me. My engine is hit. Where did they all come from?" Hartman banked hard, looking for a target for revenge. The sky, which moments ago had been clear, was now full of twisting, turning aircraft. But the majority were the sleek, predatory shapes of Mustangs. He saw 2 109s trying to climb away, using the Messerschmitt's classic strength. 2 Mustangs simply pulled their noses up and followed, climbing at an angle that seemed to defy gravity. The altitude advantage, the sacred tenet of German fighter tactics, meant nothing. These things climbed like rockets. He spotted a Mustang lining up on a fellow pilot's tail. Without thinking, Hartman rolled in behind it. This was his moment. Close to point-blank range, a quick burst and brake. He closed the distance. 300 meters, 200, 150. The Mustang's silhouette filled his Revi gunsight. He could see the details. The bubble canopy, the pale face of the pilot glancing in his mirror, the 4 dark gun ports in the wing. His thumb rested on the firing button. At 100 meters, he started to squeeze. The Mustang did something then that no aircraft in Hartman's experience could do. It seemed to leap forward as if kicked by a giant. One second it was there. The next it had simply accelerated out of his gun range, the distance opening as if he had hit a wall. It wasn't afterburners, that technology was years away. It was raw, brutal horsepower, delivered efficiently by that Merlin engine and that clean airframe. The Mustang pilot hadn't even taken evasive action, he had just powered away. Hartman stared, his mouth dry. What kind of engine did this thing have? A shadow passed over his cockpit. He looked up. Another Mustang was sliding into position above him, its wings waggling slightly as the pilot adjusted his aim. Hartman slammed the stick left and forward, throwing his 109 into a spiraling dive. Tracers ripped through the air where he had just been. He dove for a cloud layer below, a thin, wispy blanket at 15,000 feet. It was a retreat, something he rarely did. The cloud enveloped him, a gray, silent womb. For a few seconds there was nothing but the drum of his engine and the rush of air. He checked his mirror. Clear. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He emerged from the cloud's base, scanning the sky. The fight had moved. He could see distant specks and the occasional flash of gunfire high above. Below him, the Romanian countryside stretched out, peaceful and green. He was alone. He checked his fuel, enough to get home but not to re-engage. The mission was a disaster. He turned east towards Mamaia, his mind reeling. The laughter in the mess hall about the barrel with wings echoed hollowly in his memory. This was no barrel. This was a predator, faster, more powerful, and more agile than anything he had faced. And there had been so many of them. Dozens. Where had they all come from? Then he saw the contrails again, not the ones from the initial fight. These were fresh, lower, coming from the south, a new formation. He counted, his pilot's instinct overriding his shock. 8, 16, 24, they were in tight, disciplined groups of 4. Mustangs. A whole new squadron, maybe a whole new group heading north. They hadn't even been part of the main battle. They were a second wave, or perhaps a sweep ahead of another bomber stream. The sheer, profligate number of them was staggering. It wasn't just that the fighter was better. It was that there seemed to be an endless supply of them. As he watched this fresh armada cruise past, unchallenged, a terrible understanding began to dawn on Erich Hartman. This wasn't a tactical defeat. It was a systemic one. The reports hadn't been exaggerations. The dismissed intelligence wasn't wrong. They had been fighting the last war, while their enemy had built the next one. The qualitative edge was gone, shattered in a single morning over the Balkans. And if the Mustang could do this here, over the distant Romanian oil fields, then nowhere was safe. Not Germany, not the training fields, not even the factories themselves. The sanctuary of the Reichsluftwaffe had been violated by a fighter that could go anywhere. He was so absorbed in this grim revelation, his eyes fixed on the departing contrails of the second Mustang formation, that he committed the most basic error a fighter pilot can make. He stopped scanning his own immediate surroundings. The instinct honed over 150 victories screamed at him a fraction of a second too late. A shadow fell across his cockpit again, but this time from below and behind. The sun, now higher in the sky, glinted off a perspex canopy that had no business being there. In the reflection of his own cockpit glass, he saw it, the sleek, predatory shape of a P-51D, its nose painted with a checkerboard pattern, rising up from the cloud layer he had just exited. It must have followed him down, waited, and then pounced. It was so close he could see the individual exhaust stacks along its cowling and the dark, focused face of the pilot under the bubble canopy. The Mustang was not in a firing position yet. It was slightly off to the side, climbing to match his altitude. But its speed was superior, and its angle of closure was relentless. Hartman's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a slashing attack from above. This was a stalk. This pilot hadn't taken a quick shot and broken off. He had hunted him patiently, and now he had him. Hartman shoved the throttle to the emergency war power setting, feeling the DB-605 scream in protest. He yanked the stick back, trying to climb, to force an overshoot. The Mustang pilot merely pulled his nose up a fraction, the Merlin's supercharger whining as it maintained the climb rate. Hartman rolled right, then left, a series of frantic, jerky maneuvers. The Mustang mirrored each move with smooth, economical precision, staying in that lethal 6 o'clock position, closing the range meter by meter. He reached for the radio to call for help, but the channel was a chaos of static and panicked, overlapping German voices. No one was coming. He was alone. The Mustang was now well within effective range. Hartman could almost feel the pilot's thumb on the trigger. He did the only thing left. He nosed over into a vertical dive, aiming for the deck, hoping to use the 109 structural strength in a high-speed dive to escape. The airspeed needle surged, 700, 750, 800 km/h. The airframe began to vibrate, a low, ominous hum. He glanced in his mirror. The Mustang was still there, not just following but gaining. It wasn't shaking. It wasn't buffeting. It was cleaving through the air like a knife, stable and deadly. The 4 gun ports in its wings seemed to stare at him like unblinking eyes. At that moment, hurtling towards the earth at nearly 500 miles per hour, the truth crashed into Erich Hartmann with more force than any bullet. The briefings were lies. The intelligence was fantasy. The war in the air had changed while they weren't looking. He wasn't just fighting a better airplane. He was fighting an industrial system that could produce them by the thousands, and pilots who were learning how to use them with terrifying speed. The invincibility of the expert was a myth shattered by mass production and superior engineering. The ground rushed up, a blur of green and brown. He had to pull out soon or he would bury himself in it. But if he pulled out, the Mustang, with its superior high-speed control, would be right behind him for the killing shot. If he didn't pull out, he was dead anyway. He was trapped in a dive of his own making, pursued by a machine that defied everything he knew. His hand tightened on the stick. The altimeter unwound past 5,000 feet. 4,000. The vibration was becoming violent. In his mirror, the checkerboard nose of the P-51 filled the glass, so close he could see the individual black and white squares. The American pilot was waiting, holding his fire, knowing he had won. Hartman closed his eyes for a split second, not in prayer, but in final, absolute comprehension of his mistake. He pulled back on the stick with all his strength, his muscles straining against the crushing G-forces. The 109's wings groaned in agony. The world outside turned from a blur to a spinning panorama of sky and ground. He was blacking out, the gray tunnel closing in from the edges of his vision. He didn't know if he would recover in time. He didn't know if the wings would stay on. And he didn't know, as the gray turned to black and the scream of the wind faded, whether the .450 caliber guns of the Mustang had already begun to fire. The first burst missed. It was not a miss of inaccuracy, but of timing. The American pilot, First Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Carter of the 307th Fighter Squadron, 31st Fighter Group, had held his fire a heartbeat too long, waiting for the perfect deflection shot as the 109 began its recovery. The .450 caliber Brownings roared, sending a stream of 800 rounds per minute arcing just behind the Messerschmitt's tailplane. The tracers, a mix of red and orange, flashed past Hartman's canopy like deadly fireflies. The sound was not the sharp crack of cannon shells, but a deeper, ripping brrrrrrp that vibrated through the air. Hartman felt the aircraft buck as he pulled out of the dive, the G-forces slamming him down into his seat, so hard the leather harness cut into his shoulders. His vision swam, a tunnel of gray with a small circle of clarity at the end. He saw the horizon, a tilted line of green and blue slowly righting itself. The airspeed bled off rapidly. 600, 500, 400 km/h. He was vulnerable, a slow, heavy target just above the treetops. He instinctively kicked the rudder, skidding the aircraft in a desperate, energy-sapping maneuver to spoil the American's aim. The second burst came as he leveled out. This one was closer. 3 of the 4 heavy machine guns found their mark. Hartman heard and felt the impact simultaneously, a sound like a giant fist hammering the fuselage. Thump, 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 crack. The left side of his cockpit exploded in a shower of plexiglass fragments. A searing pain lanced across his cheek. The instrument panel in front of him disintegrated. The altimeter needle spun wildly, the airspeed indicator froze, and a dozen warning lights flickered and died. The sharp, acrid smell of cordite, hot metal, and burning insulation flooded the cockpit. A jagged hole the size of a fist appeared in the left side of the canopy, and the wind, howling at over 300 miles per hour, became a deafening, tearing roar. His beloved Bf-109, the aircraft that had carried him to 148 victories, was dying. The DB-605 engine began to run rough, its powerful song degenerating into a ragged, metallic cough. Black oil, thick and hot, splattered against the windscreen, obscuring his view. The controls grew heavy, the stick resisting his movements. He glanced in his mirror. The Mustang was still there, hanging back slightly now, like a wolf that had wounded its prey and was waiting for it to weaken. The checkerboard nose was unmistakable. Hartman could see the American pilot's head turning, watching him, assessing the damage. There was no frantic follow-up attack. The pilot was disciplined, professional. He knew the fight was over. Hartman's mind, trained for survival, clicked into a cold, procedural mode. The pain in his face was a distant thing. The roar of the wind was background noise. He scanned the remaining instruments. Fuel pressure was dropping. Oil temperature was spiking into the red. The engine's ragged cough turned into a series of violent shudders. Flames, orange and hungry, began to lick back from the engine cowling, whipped by the slipstream. The aircraft was on fire. He had seconds. Mayday, mayday, he rasped into his radio, his voice surprisingly calm. Blondie is hit, engine fire, going down south of the field. He didn't know his exact position. It didn't matter. There was no response from Borchers or anyone else. The radio was dead, its wires likely severed by the .50 caliber rounds. He was utterly alone, a burning coffin 500 meters above the Romanian plains. The decision was automatic. He reached down with his left hand, fumbling for the red-painted handle between his legs, the canopy jettison lever. He yanked it. Nothing happened. The mechanism was damaged. He cursed, a short, guttural sound lost in the wind. He balled his right fist, wrapped his leather glove around it, and slammed it against the cracked and holed canopy. Once, twice. On the third blow, the entire perspex structure, weakened by the gunfire, tore loose from its rails and vanished into the slipstream with a terrible shriek. The noise was now apocalyptic. The screaming wind, the dying engine's death rattle, the roar of the fire eating into the airframe. The force of the air pinned him back. He unbuckled his harness, the straps whipping away. The ground was rushing up, a patchwork of fields and small woods. He had to get out. He stood up in the cockpit, the wind trying to tear him from the aircraft. He placed his boots on the seat, pushed himself up and to the right, rolling over the side of the fuselage. For a moment, he was tumbling through chaos, a puppet in a hurricane of noise and fire and spinning earth. Then he pulled the ripcord on his parachute. The silk blossomed above him with a comforting, solid thump, and the world snapped into a sudden, surreal silence. The roar was gone, replaced by the gentle sigh of the wind in the shroud lines. He was swinging gently beneath the white canopy. Below him, his Messerschmitt, trailing a thick plume of black smoke, continued its death dive. It struck a field in a silent, distant blossom of orange flame and black earth, the sound reaching him a few seconds later as a dull, crumping explosion. He looked up. The Mustang was circling him, a slow, wide orbit about 1,000 feet above. The sun glinted off its bubble canopy. Hartman felt a wave of irrational anger, then a hollow resignation. He was a prize, a trophy floating down under silk. The American pilot could, by the rules of this brutal game, shoot him. Many did. He waited for the tracers. None came. The Mustang waggled its wings once, a strangely formal gesture, then pointed its nose to the west and climbed away, its Merlin engine a fading hum. The pilot had broken off, his mission complete. Hartman was left swinging in the sudden quiet, the only sounds the creak of the harness and the distant cawing of crows startled by the crash. He landed awkwardly in a plowed field, the impact driving the air from his lungs. He struggled out of the parachute harness, his hands trembling not from fear but from adrenaline withdrawal. The left side of his face was wet with blood. He touched it. A long, shallow gash ran from his temple to his jawline, peppered with tiny glass fragments. It stung fiercely. He got to his feet, unsteady. In the distance, a column of black smoke marked the grave of his aircraft. He could see a farmhouse, a few peasants standing in a yard, pointing. The walk to captivity was short. A Romanian army truck, followed by a car with 2 officers, arrived within 20 minutes. They were polite, almost apologetic. He was, after all, a German officer, a hero with the Knight's Cross. But he was also a pilot who had been shot down over Allied territory. They took his pistol, his knife, and his flying jacket. One of the Romanian lieutenants, a young man with anxious eyes, offered him a cigarette. Hartman took it, nodding his thanks. As they drove him towards a temporary holding facility, he looked out the window at the peaceful countryside. The war felt very far away. But the image of the checkerboard-nosed Mustang, hanging in his mirror, was seared into his mind. The scale of the defeat did not become clear to him until he was returned to Mamaia airfield later that evening, after a perfunctory medical check and debriefing, by a Luftwaffe intelligence officer, who seemed more interested in the new Mustang's performance than in Hartman's well-being. The dispersal area, usually buzzing with the sound of engines being tested and the banter of ground crews, was shrouded in a funereal silence. Of the 24 Bf-109s of III/JG-52 that had scrambled that morning, only 11 had returned. And of those, 4 were so badly damaged they would be out of action for weeks. The missing 13 included 2 Staffelkapitän, 4 other veteran pilots with over 50 kills each, and Walter Krupinski. The ground crews moved with hushed voices, avoiding the eyes of the surviving pilots who sat in small, stunned groups outside the operations hut. Major Borchers, his face pale and drawn, gathered the survivors. "The mission was a catastrophe," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual confident edge. "Initial reports confirm we encountered a new type of P-51. They were faster at all altitudes, could outclimb us and outdive us. Their pilots were aggressive. They did not break off." He paused, looking at the faces of his men, faces that hours before had been confident, almost bored. Now they were etched with shock and a new, unfamiliar fear. "We have lost good men. The enemy has gained a significant advantage. Our tactics must change. From now on, we avoid engagement with the escort unless conditions are overwhelmingly favorable. Our priority remains the bombers." The words were a formal admission of defeat. The sacred tenet of the Jäger to seek and destroy the enemy fighter had been publicly abandoned. They were to run from the escorts. Hartman listened, the cut on his face throbbing in time with his heartbeat. He thought of the second formation of Mustangs he had seen, the fresh, untouched armada cruising past. Borcher's new tactics were a survival measure, not a path to victory. How could you avoid an enemy that was everywhere, in numbers you could not match? The disaster over Mamaia was not an isolated incident. It was a single, violent tremor in a continent-wide earthquake that was shattering the Luftwaffe's fighter force. In the 6 weeks following that May morning, as Hartman's wound healed and he returned to flying with a profound new caution, the statistical reality became horrifically clear. On the Western Front, the numbers were apocalyptic. During the critical month of June 1944, as the Allies stormed Normandy, the USAAF's 8th and 9th Air Forces unleashed their Mustang and Thunderbolt-escorted bombers with relentless fury. The Luftwaffe was forced to defend the invasion beaches and the Reich itself simultaneously. The result was a slaughter. In June alone, the Germans lost 1,000 244 fighter pilots killed, missing, or captured in the West. The attrition rate was unsustainable. The training schools, already shortened and hampered by fuel shortages, could not replace them. A new pilot in mid-minus 1,944 received barely 160 hours of total flight time before being sent to a frontline unit, compared to over 250 in 1942. They were boys flying complex, demanding aircraft against veterans in superior machines. The kill ratios, once comfortably in Germany's favor, inverted with brutal finality. In the first half of 1944, the overall loss-exchange ratio between USAAF fighters and the Luftwaffe in Western Europe was approximately 1.5 German fighters lost for every American. By the third quarter, after the full deployment of the P-51D and the latest P-47N models, that ratio skyrocketed to between 4:1 and 7:1 in the Americans' favor during some of the largest engagements. A confidential report from the Luftwaffe's own Quartermaster General, stamped Geheim and dated July 15, 1944, laid out the grim arithmetic. Current loss rates of single-engine fighters exceed production by 40%. Pilot losses exceed training output by 300%. At this rate, the fighter arm will cease to be an effective force by early 1945. The reactions from other combatants across the Axis alliance echoed the same shock, a chorus of dismay from different theaters. In the Pacific, the same P-51D that hunted Hartmann was beginning to appear over the home islands of Japan, escorting B-29 superfortresses. A captured diary from a Japanese naval aviator, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, stationed at Atsugi Airfield in late 1944, contained an entry that mirrored Hartmann's revelation. The new American fighter, the Mustang, is a devil. Our Zero-Sen cannot catch it in a dive or a climb above 20,000 shaku. It turns almost as well, and its guns tear our aircraft to pieces. They come in such numbers. We set 10 aircraft against 30. It is not a battle. It is a ceremony of destruction. In the Mediterranean, Italian pilots who had transitioned to flying for the fascist Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana after Italy's surrender reported identical encounters. A communiqué from the 1st Fighter Group, Assaut di Bastoni, to German liaison officers in September 1944 stated bluntly, "Operations against formations escorted by the P-51 billion/D are prohibitively costly. Recommended to engage only when numerical superiority is at least 3:1 in our favor." The request was fantasy. The numerical superiority was always, invariably, on the other side. The perspective from the Engineering and Intelligence Corps was one of horrified admiration. At the Luftwaffe's Central Technical Intelligence Depot at Richlin, engineers pored over the wreckage of a P-51D that had force-landed in France. Their report, circulated to a select few in the Air Ministry and aircraft firms, was a masterpiece of reluctant praise. "The airframe exhibits exceptional cleanliness of design," it read. "The laminar flow wing profile achieves a drag coefficient approximately 20% lower than the Bf-109G wing. The Packard-built Merlin engine, while conceptually similar to the DB605, demonstrates superior supercharger design and cooling efficiency, maintaining full military power to an altitude of over 30,000 feet. The airframe is notably robust and designed for ease of maintenance. Major components are interchangeable and require fewer man-hours to produce than equivalent German parts." One engineer, a veteran of Messerschmitt's design bureau who had worked on the 109 since 1936, was said to have stared at the dissected Merlin for a long time before muttering to his colleague, "We have been perfecting the pocket watch. They have built a railroad." The highest levels of command reacted with a mixture of denial, fury, and desperate, impossible orders. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, upon being presented with the loss figures for June, reportedly flew into a rage, accusing his pilots of cowardice and lack of fighting spirit. He issued a directive ordering that henceforth fighter pilots would stay and engage the American escorts to the death to prove German superiority. Veteran commanders in the field, men like Galland, quietly ignored the order, knowing it was a death sentence for what remained of their units. In a bunker conference in East Prussia, an agitated Hitler interrupted a briefing on fighter losses, slamming his fist on the map table. These numbers are lies. The Me-262 will sweep these prop planes from the sky. Why is it not here? I was promised jets. The technological leap to the jet-powered Me-262 was indeed real, but it was crippled by delays, technical problems, fuel shortages, and Hitler's own insistence that it be used as a bomber. By the time significant numbers reached frontline units in late 1944, the air war was already lost, the skies black with Allied aircraft that outnumbered the jets 20-1. For the men in the cockpits, the psychological impact was corrosive. The culture of the expert, the nightly duelists of the sky, collapsed under the weight of industrial warfare. Diaries from the period show a sharp shift in tone. Lieutenant Franz Müller of JG-3, a pilot with 38 victories, wrote in his journal in August 1944, "We are no longer hunters. We are the hunted. We take off not to seek victory but to survive for another day. The sky belongs to the armies. You see 40, 50 of them, sometimes more. They fly with an arrogance that is earned. We skulk at low altitude, hoping not to be seen. This is not the war I knew." The pressure broke veterans. There were increasing, though rarely documented, instances of engine trouble or navigation errors that saw pilots turning back before reaching the combat zone. The term Druckgeber, pressure giver, entered the slang, describing a pilot who cracked under the strain. The average life expectancy of a new pilot on the Western Front in late 1944 was measured in weeks, sometimes in mere sorties. For those who became prisoners of war, the scale of the industrial disparity became physically visible. Oberfeldwebel Hans Weber, a FW-190 pilot shot down over Belgium in September 1944 and transported to a POW camp in England, described in a post-war interview the moment his understanding shifted. "We were being moved by train somewhere in the Midlands. We passed an airfield, a huge one. Lines of Mustangs, row upon row, stretched into the distance. I stopped counting at 50. They were clean, new, fresh from the factory. Next to the airfield was a repair depot. I saw damaged Mustangs, some with whole tails missing, wings patched, being worked on by teams of men. The activity was like an anthill. And I thought of our field at Wiesbaden, with 6 serviceable 190s, and the 2 precious tankers of fuel we guarded with machine guns. We were not fighting an air force. We were fighting a factory that had learned to fly." The strategic impact of this shift was total and irreversible. The P-51 Mustang, and to a similar extent the long-range P-47N and the P-38J, did not just win air battles. They changed the geography of the war. With the advent of these little friends that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, the Allied combined bomber offensive achieved its decisive purpose. The Luftwaffe was forced into a battle of attrition it could not win. German fighter production, though it reached its wartime peak in 1944 at over 25,000 single-engine fighters, was utterly dwarfed by Allied output. The United States alone produced over 23,000 P-51s and 15,000 P-47s during the war. Every German pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every American pilot lost was, from a cold industrial standpoint, a unit of production that could be replaced by another pilot and another factory-fresh aircraft within weeks. This air superiority had a direct, cascading effect on the ground war. With the skies cleared of the Luftwaffe's threat, Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, roamed at will over Normandy and later across France and Germany, strafing and bombing troops, tanks, trains, and supply columns with impunity. The German army, once reliant on the swift movement of armored divisions, found itself paralyzed, forced to move only at night or under cloud cover. The D-Day landings were secured under an umbrella of Allied air power. The failed German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, was initially launched under cover of bad weather, but when the skies cleared, thousands of Allied fighters and fighter-bombers decimated the German spearheads, turning roads into graveyards of burning vehicles. The sanctuary of the Reich was gone. The engineer's prophetic memo about the Mustang's range had been precisely correct. American fighters now loitered over German airfields, shooting down aircraft as they took off and landed, a tactic called fighter sweeps or rat-catching. Pilot training, already inadequate, became suicidal as novice flyers were intercepted and killed over their own training schools. The fuel crisis, exacerbated by the bombing of synthetic oil plants that the Mustangs now defended, grounded entire squadrons. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe fighter arm was a phantom, a force that existed mostly on paper, its surviving veterans flying handful of sorties in carefully hoarded, poorly fueled aircraft against an enemy that owned the sky. Erich Hartmann survived the war. The ace of aces adapted, as he always had. He abandoned his beloved Sehnen-Chaden-Angreifen abhauen tactic. In the face of the Mustang hordes, he developed a new, survivalist approach. Stalk from above, make one high speed, slashing attack on the bombers if the escort was distracted, and then dive away at maximum speed, using the 109 small size and the ground clutter to escape. He added another 50 victories to his tally by war's end, many of them Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front, where the qualitative disparity was less pronounced, bringing his final count to an astonishing 352. But even there, the shadow of the Western industrial might was felt. In late 1944, his unit began to encounter Soviet pilots flying Lend-Lease P-39 Airacobras and, in increasing numbers, P-63 Kingcobras, capable American fighters provided by the same industrial machine that built the Mustang. Hartmann's final flight of the war was not against a Mustang. It was on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. Ordered to fly to an American-controlled airfield to avoid capture by the Soviets, he instead led his group to land at a field held by U.S. troops, destroying their remaining Bf-109s on the ground after surrendering. As he climbed out of his cockpit for the last time, he saw, parked on the other side of the field, rows of P-51 Mustangs, their engines silent, their pilots watching the defeated Germans with casual, confident curiosity. The checkerboard noses, the invasion stripes, the myriad of personal insignia. They represented a world of plenty, of endless production, that he had never truly comprehended until that moment in the dive over Romania a year before. The American pilot who had shot him down on May 30, 1944, First Lieutenant Jimmy Carter, survived the war with 5.5 aerial victories, including the probable credit for Hartmann's Bf-109. He returned to Ohio, worked in the automotive industry, and rarely spoke of the war. He remembered the encounter with the German ace only as a tough 109 who knew how to fly, unaware of the identity of the pilot whose life he had spared by not firing on the parachute. The two men, instruments of vast historical forces, never met again. When the final accounting was done, the numbers told the story with devastating clarity. Between D-Day and VE Day, the USAAF's 8th Air Force alone claimed the destruction of 5,280 German aircraft in aerial combat for the loss of 1,046 of its own fighters, a ratio of over 5:1. The total production of P-51 Mustangs reached 15,586. The Luftwaffe, in its entire war against the Western Allies, destroyed approximately 19,000 of them, but in the process, it lost the core of its fighter pilot elite and ultimately control of the skies over Europe. The Mustang did not win the war alone, no single weapon ever does. But it was the scalpel that excised the Luftwaffe's defensive capability, making the strategic bombing campaign effective and the Allied ground advance unstoppable. Years later, in a Soviet prison camp where he spent 10 years after being handed over by the Americans, Erich Hartmann would reflect on that turning point. In letters to his wife, he wrote of the Eastern Front, of his men, of survival. But in an interview decades after his release, when asked about the greatest challenge he ever faced in the air, he did not speak of the hundreds of Soviet fighters he had engaged. He spoke of a single, clear morning in May 1944. "That was the day we realized the rules had changed," he said, his voice quiet. "Before that, we fought against pilots and airplanes. After that, we fought against mathematics. And mathematics is a cold, unbeatable enemy." The laughter in the mess hall had died, not just in their throats, but in the very concept of a war they could win. The duelist had met the assembly line, and the assembly line, with its relentless, impersonal efficiency, had prevailed.